Okay, I quickly will give you OLAW's perspective on what's expected with social housing, but since we've heard a lot from Dr. Bradfield, a lot of that will be reiteration, but I'll also indicate when it might not be the best idea. Wrong one. Wait a minute, they're all clicking now. Okay, got it. Yep. Okay, so if you recognize this, you're probably at an assured institution and your institution needs to comply with the PHS policy. Now it goes the other way. Now, let me use these. I'm gonna use these down here. Okay, and so the PHS policy states that you need to base your program on the guide. So a lot of the things that Dr. Bradfield said, I'm going to reiterate, but I'll point out some key other things in the guide language that you should be aware of. So animals should be housed under conditions that provide sufficient space as well as supplementary structures and resources. This is actually pretty important. If you put them together as social groups and they have other stuff to do in the cage and places to hide and places to get away from the others, your success of socially housing them would be greater. So throwing rabbits into a barren enclosure and expecting them to get along may not work. So it's the structure and complexity of that environment that they're going into that'll help increase the success of your social housing efforts. Animals should be housed in stable pairs or groups of compatible individuals. As was mentioned, this is often at the individual basis. There could be one ram, one dog, one rhesus that's just known to be a bad guy. It doesn't get along with anybody else. I'll go over what should be done for those types of animals, but if that individual is constantly getting into fights with the others, there's no reason to keep trying to throw other animals in with that specific individual. That does not mean that everybody in that species necessarily is incompatible, although in some situations, certain strains of animals, for a beta fighting fish or something like that, you're not going to constantly try to put them together because they're known to be aggressive towards one another. So in situations like that, you may be able to exempt a certain group or strain. In other situations, you may just need to exempt a very specific individual. So with fish, you want to put them together if they are known to be a schooling species. Environmental strategies for fish have not been that well established. We go and visit many facilities, OLAW does, and we've seen some situations where zebrafish have little plastic plants in there. Others, they don't. Some folks say the plastic plants just grow algae. So if you are putting things in there, make sure that it is safe for the animals and really does something. And that's not just a window dressing for the people that look in the cage and that it looks nice, but it is helpful for the animals and they use it. That's, for instance, with frogs. They like to hide under things, and if you have animals that come out on land, there should be some terrestrial area provided. But again, even with these guys, visual barriers, hides, and shading are all appropriate and will greatly increase your chances of housing these guys with others because they have places to get away if there are aggressive encounters, and they can establish little territorial areas. As was stated, for a social species, it should be the exception and should be based on either veterinary reasons or strongly justified scientific reasons. Now, we've looked at protocols where the strong scientific reason is. We've done this study with single-housed animals, and we will in perpetuity do it, and that's not a scientific reason. Things change. Things should be reevaluated. Pilot studies can be done to see if indeed there is a difference between social and single housing, and basing it on purely historic data and that all our publications have stated this that's not strong enough. Okay, so when don't you want to put animals together? When they are overly aggressive or debilitated, when there's the chance of contagious disease. As I said, if they're incompatible, if there's a veterinary reason, they need to be taken away from one another, and for this strong scientific justification. Once they are separated, this should be done for the minimum period necessary, and they should be provided, if possible, with visual, olfactory, and tactile contact. That, of course, would not be the case if there's contagious disease or if an overly aggressive animal can reach through and wound somebody. So a lot of this depends on professional judgment and also some common sense. And in general, when they are singly housed, try to provide some other stimulating enrichment for them. If they are singly housed, it should be for the shortest time possible, unless they are permanently exempted and need to be singly housed. If they're in small enclosures, maybe they should be let out into a larger enclosure so they can have exercise, if that works for that species and for that study. Enrichment should be offered, including interaction with staff. We've said this already, but again, that needs to be common sense. You don't want people sticking their fingers into monkey cages, but there can be offering of treats or something like that, just so that there's something that stimulates the animals. Give them additional enrichment devices, rotate them around so that they don't become habituated to them. Or if there's if you're able to do that, add a companion animal in the room or housing area so they at least have that other conspecific or animal of another species in there to offer them some stimulation. Not all members of a social group are compatible. Trying to throw ones together that are not compatible can really stress out the submissive one, can cause injury and death. When establishing stable social hierarchies, as was mentioned by Dr. Baker and some of the other speakers, antagonistic interactions can occur. So that, and pigs too. If you throw them together, they'll scratch each other up and bite each other. But after a while, this does settle down. But people need to be in there watching this. They need to be very knowledgeable about what they're seeing and whether it's leading to behavior that'll really cause some permanent issues, or they're just scuffling around. Then there may be bleeding and may need to treat some wounds. But once the hierarchy is established, with chickens too, it usually settles down. Aggression is often gender-based. Risks, and I'll keep reiterating this because I think it's pretty important. Risks of social incompatibility are greatly reduced if animals are grouped together at a young age and they're kept together, and many institutions now order, for instance, rabbits or primates as socially compatible youngsters, and they're kept together as a group. Usually, if they're not kept apart too long on a study, because they have to be separated, they can be reintroduced with much less stress. And the enclosures, as I said, if they are enriched with places to hide, can greatly increase your success. Social stability should be carefully monitored because even stable groups can suddenly start falling apart and they can start fighting. And if animals are taken out for treatment or for studies, the length of time that they're away also has a great impact on how easily they can be reintroduced. Yeah, okay, well, this just reiterates a lot of the things that Dr. Baker had said. They need to be monitored closely during introductory periods to determine compatibility and when too much aggression is just too much and that it will not work. So, if a strain or sex is known to habitually show unresolved aggression, apply a performance standard to avoid injuries or distress. If this is known to occur all the time, there's no reason to attempt it ad infinitum with ongoing stress to the animals that are being put together. If it's a known fact, again, this could be individual-based, it could be strain-based, but you can't exempt an entire species unless you know for a fact already, based on the literature, that these animals just are not able to be put together. They are habitually going to fight, and in a situation like that, establish an IACUC-approved policy to address situations of this type of habitual aggression. No one expects you to try and find the one individual that may get along with all those others at the risk of having numerous animals injured or hurt when the chance of success is actually pretty poor. So do not continue social housing attempts in situations where it's known not to work. The types of structural additions in large compounds, again, this is for primates, are perches, visual barriers, manipulable resources. So again, they have stuff to do other than just fighting with one another. toys for primates, dogs, cats, swine, wooden chew sticks for rodent species, and nesting material for mice. This is all very helpful for them to distract them just from the other animals. It gives them something to do, and it's a form of enrichment as well in general. Animals which may be difficult to socially house include adult rabbits, some macaques, African green monkeys, baboons, and male swine. And I'll go over, though, examples where even though these groups may fall into this challenges for social housing, there are situations where the common knowledge has shown actually not to be true. Studies involving jacketed animals, ones with head caps, infectious disease, food or fluid restriction. Well, clearly with infectious disease, if they're shedding or infectious, that's not the time to put them together, but that may not be the entire time. So there may be, throughout the study, a time when the animals are not shedding, when they could potentially be put together. So even though some animals may be exempted due to aggression, use a performance standard and don't assume in all cases that it has the same outcome. And it's very important, as Dr. Baker had said, document the histories and the pairing attempts. When we come in and they say, yeah, we tried to put those two monkeys together once and it didn't work, well, we really need to see some kind of records of how was that done. Did you use these sliding barriers and things like that? How many attempts were made? Document that. So when we've spoken to folks at institutions around the country, the common knowledge was that any primate with a head cap can't be paired with another one, but we actually found that in some situations, while they don't immediately go and tear each other's head caps off, they were actually found to be, in some situations, grooming the margin and kept it cleaner, and there was not a greater incidence of dislodging the cap. So just because they have a head cap does not necessarily mean that that is an immediate reason for them not to be socially housed. Male rabbits housed together when young and placed in an environment with shelters, site blocks, and escape areas may be successfully co-housed, and I've seen that at some places that we visited. Take empty runs or big floor spaces, have large pens around there, and there's shavings on the floor, and lots of little huts and houses and places they can get onto and under, and the folks working there indicated they just had absolute great success with that. I was wondering how they would pick them up if they needed a specific rabbit, but apparently they would stay in a certain hutch and were trained by the caretakers to come out, and they demonstrated that. This was not just that we read the records. I thought I was kind of questioning that, and they demonstrated how that was being done, so that was pretty impressive. And then some adult macaques can be successfully housed with a juvenile. And it's extremely important that staff is trained to know what they're doing, to know what they're seeing, and recognizing when too much is too much. They should, the animal caretakers and behavioral staff should receive training in behavioral biology of the species they work with so they can appropriately monitor the effects of enrichment and these pairing attempts in social housing and groups, and recognizing when group stability is starting to fall apart, when some of the alpha animals are starting to lose their authority and they're starting to wane, and then there's competition with the next bunch coming up. Trained folks know what they're looking for in situations like that, because just because you've got a successful, stable group at one point in time does not mean that it can't deteriorate and fall apart. And it's very important that the people working with these animals are aware of when it starts to go a little bit awry, so that you don't wind up finding dead animals that have fought. And we unfortunately do hear about situations like that, and it does happen, but some of these things can be avoided with astute staff that know what they're looking for. And there are lots of resources for institutions to use. Besides the guide and the animal welfare regulations, which say what the expectations are, there's also guidance and papers, because people are now really publishing a lot on this and indicating that, of what I just said, that some of these, what had been considered very well-established reasons for not to house animals in the past, there are exceptions. Some people are very successful with housing certain groups of animals together, but it is a lot of work. And so yes, as Dr. Bradfield said, resources are very important. A lot of staff time goes into this, and certainly the places where they live and all the housing areas in which they are often unique and not what is found in most normal housing arrangements. So if an institution is clever and can reuse old dog runs, for instance, for rabbits or something like that, they may not have to go out and buy new stuff. We have a lot of guidance on our website. Check the current literature, and do use the professional judgment of the vet behaviorists and the investigators. A lot of the folks seem to think the investigators don't know, but they are often the most knowledgeable about the species they're working with, and they really should be consulted. And this is a win-win situation because the welfare of the animals ultimately leads to better data. And then do apply common sense. If something really just doesn't work, no use to force it and then cause more stress, because the whole idea of this co-housing is to provide a more normal and natural environment and reduce the stress on the animals, but that's not always the case. And with that, we'll take questions at the end, and Carol Clark will come up.